So this is a big year for ICLR. We're 20 years old this year. So for 2 decades now, my colleagues and I have been working basically to reduce the impact of natural catastrophes on people and property in Canada. And since the beginning, our tagline has been building resilient communities. I think when we were formed 20 years ago, big natural catastrophes were kind of other people's problems. We didn't really have really large, costly, impactful catastrophes in Canada. Certainly we had our share of medium and small events like everybody else, but we were largely spared from the really big disasters. But the committee that formed us kind of knew that the trend would hit Canada one day, that we'd be getting hit with large, impactful disasters, and they wanted to get ahead of that, and they created us 20 years ago. They kind of figured that losses would come with a vengeance, and they most certainly did. And funny enough, about 4 or 5 days after we became a legal entity and not-for-profit, the ice storm 98 began, affecting eastern Ontario, Quebec, and into eastern Canada later on. That loss was the largest insured loss in Canadian history for 15 years. It fell to second place after the Alberta flooding in 2013, and then to third place after Fort McMurray last year. We've built up quite a reputation. So now when something happens either in the world or in Canada, the media call us for our thoughts. And certainly the day of the Japanese earthquake and tsunami in March 2011, the phone rang off the hook. We did 20 some odd media interviews by lunch alone. We were very busy by the Alberta flooding in 2013. I'm still fielding calls from Fort McMurray, particularly since it's the 1-year anniversary of that event. But over the last couple of days, it's been the flooding in Gatineau and Ottawa that's got the phone ringing off the hook and me running around. We know that natural disasters are increasing in frequency and severity worldwide. It's not just a Canadian problem. And we see a really big uptick in these events since about the 1980s, mid-80s onward. And when I look at that upward trend line of losses, there's really only a couple of handfuls of earthquake in there. Where we're seeing the growth is with storm events. Hydro-Meteorological events. These are events that involve wind, water, or wind-driven water. Now, you may not know this, but Public Safety Canada runs the Canadian Disaster Database. It's an open database. You can find it on Google very easily. There are about 800 events in that database going back to the year 1900. And you can easily download the data and play with it. You can look at it by type of hazard, by loss of life, by geography, whatever it happens to be. We downloaded that data and we sorted it out by hazard area, natural hazard area. And what we found is that up to 40% of the events in the database are overland flood. So overland flood is the most common peril in Canada. But overland flood is also the most common peril in pretty much every country in the world, particularly industrialized countries. But the other thing is, we found that water plays a role in many, many other losses in Canada. I'm talking water either in its liquid form or its frozen form, overland flood, convective thunderstorm, storm surges on the coast, snowstorms, ice storms, hail, you name it. Water plays a very big role in catastrophe losses in Canada. So if I look at this Canadian data, what we find is that disasters are also increasing in frequency and severity in Canada. We also found that, like the international data, all the growth is with storms. Hydro-meteorological events, events that involve wind, water, or wind-driven water. So essentially, the international trend is the Canadian trend too. Now, the United Nations University, through the Risk Index, ranks countries according to the risk of natural catastrophes. In that risk index, Canada ranks very low risk. I think, though, things are changing, and not for the better. We've had an almost unbroken string of really large catastrophe losses in Canada since about 2009. I'm talking losses of $1 billion or more. And it's been quite an incredible string, and in my 26 years in insurance and reinsurance, I've never seen anything like it. In 2012, these losses exceeded $1.2 billion. These are insured losses. In 2011, they exceeded $1.5 billion. In 2013, they exceeded $3 billion, largely owing to the Calgary flood, and then Toronto 3 weeks later. Last year, they exceeded $5 billion. This is insured damage. Those numbers alone may not scare you. Well, they should, but they may not. But what happens if I add them all up? So the way we define a catastrophe in the Canadian insurance industry is we define it as an event of 25 million in claims or higher. And when you add up all these events, 25 million or higher, from 2009 to 2016, we get $14.2 billion. So that's 14.2 billion with the B dollars. It's a big number for a country like Canada, particularly since we're rated very low risk by the UN University. Now, there's some good news in this, and that is that the number of people dying or being injured in natural catastrophe events is going down in Canada and in the rest of mostly the industrialized world. The bad news, on the other hand, is that property damage and the impact on economies is getting worse. So we're doing a very good job at saving people. We're not doing a very good job at protecting property and our economy. I'll tell you, insurers and reinsurance companies know this all too well by the numbers I've just showed you a few minutes ago. So what's going on? Why are there more storms and why are they impacting us more? Well, I could sit here all day and just give you a litany of reasons. Sit here for hours. But we kind of narrow it down to three main areas. First of all, there's more people and property at risk, both in Canada and elsewhere in the world. People living on fault lines, on coastlines, in floodplains, next to or within the boreal forest. You get the idea. And some people don't realize they're living in a place of risk, and other people know it all too well but choose to ignore it and live their lives. And over the last few days alone, I've seen many people on the news say, yeah, I'm in Gatineau, yeah, I knew I lived on the floodplain, but I chose to live here, it's very nice. And we see that kind of decision over and over and over again. The second major driver we see is aging infrastructure. Religiously, we used to spend about 5 points of GDP on infrastructure in Canada. We haven't seen that type of thing for a long time. We're in around the 3% range these days. And what we tend to do is when the economy goes south, we shovel a couple of billion more in infrastructure to get people working. And when the economy is strong, we take away from that dollar value. We view infrastructure in this country as a way to get people to work, not for the purpose that the infrastructure was meant to provide us. That has to change. And when I worry about infrastructure, I worry about things like overland flood infrastructure, and I worry about storm sewer systems and things of that nature. And what happens when we give local governments money for infrastructure? They put it into an ice rink or a rec center because that's the type of thing that gets you reelected. Putting in a new storm sewer system, who cares about that, right? And third, the climate is changing. It's really, really difficult to look at the weather data and the damage data and parse out what part of it is climate change and what part is something we would have gotten anyway. And let me say, in no uncertain terms, climate change does not cause severe weather. No matter what you're told, it does not cause it. It makes it worse. It exacerbates it. It's kind of a force multiplier. And the thing that I like is this term that climate change is weather on steroids. Okay? It increases the odds of severe weather events. I should say that while the Earth has warmed by about 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution, Canada has warmed by about twice that, and the Arctic by about 3 times that. When I go back to that whole idea of more people and property at risk, urbanization plays a really big role here. Like most of the Western industrialized world, we are urban dwellers. We live in cities. And that means more assets packed into tight places. It also means more pavement, bigger roofs on things like big box stores, less green space, And then we have more users of water and generators of wastewater packed into very tiny places. And so nowadays, even just a run-of-the-mill rainstorm can cause a significant loss event. The water just has no place to go. So what can we do? And often when I give my presentation with slides, I forewarn people that my presentation's a real bummer. But there are two courses of action that we see can be taken. The first is loss prevention, and the second is risk transfer. I could take loss prevention and I could further break it down into three things. The first is there are structural measures that we can take. So we can build berms, dams, levees, seawalls, dikes, put in better stormwater systems, put in fire breaks around the boreal, things of that nature. These things are important, but we have to remember we can't engineer ourselves out of every problem, nor should we try. This is where we talk about building code, and building code is important. It's extremely important. We just heard about the earthquake in Haiti. And, we don't get really, really large loss of life in places like Canada, Western Europe, places where building codes are good. And also important where building code inspection is good. Places where there's no building code, where there's weak building code, where there's no inspection, we see much greater loss of life in natural disasters than we normally should. There are non-structural measures then. This is the second subpoint. And this is where we talk about land use planning. It's more ideational things, not physical walls, but policy and other decisions that can make us more resilient. Now, if you take those two things together, structural measures, including building code, and non-structural measures, including land use planning, like getting people off of floodplains and away from the boreal, those things taken together are very, very powerful, and I believe that we can reduce a lot of the grief caused by natural disasters if we are better at those two things. We do have a good building code in Canada. We build good homes. They can be better. And I'll tell you in a few minutes some of the work that we're doing to see that through. And the third subpoint is public awareness. Getting private property owners on side, getting them into the discussion, helping them realize that there are measures that they can take to make themselves and their families safer and their properties more resilient. I can tell you, governments can spend billions and billions and billions on mitigation. If nothing is done on the private property side, it's all for naught. The private property is key. So to this end, we work with the insurance industry, and we work with governments at all levels in Canada, increasingly, though, more municipal governments than anybody else. We work over 5 main peril areas. Okay, we work in the area of wildfire, earthquake, wind, hail, and water. On the water side, it's mostly urban flooding. Flooding in cities caused by extreme rainfall events. We don't do as much on the riverine side, but we do a lot on the urban flooding side. We recently issued our latest 5-year plan, and in it, we're concentrating on 4 things. It's not the only things that we're working on, but it's the 4 major foci. The first is on basement flooding. This is a problem from coast to coast in Canada. There's probably not a municipal area in Canada that doesn't have a problem with water and or sewage getting into people's basements. We're talking about a $2 billion problem every year. So we're working a lot in the areas of how to find mitigation measures to prevent this from happening, how to get homeowners on side. So a lot of the work we do is getting homeowners on side here. Second thing that we're concentrating on is how to make the next generation of new homes in Canada better. And this is where we're doing our building code work. So over the last few years, we have been making submissions to the Canadian Model Building Code and to the Ontario Building Code for now to try to get the next generation of homes built better. We're focusing mainly on wind and basement flooding to change the code. And what we're suggesting is just little tweaks, little gaps that can be filled in the code to make homes more resilient. So in Ontario, one of our code changes got through where roof sheathing on all new homes in Ontario was fastened down a little bit differently. And some wordings regarding backwater valves, those devices that help you prevent sewage surcharging in your basement. Right now we have several changes before the National Building Code Commission and several in front of the Ontario Building Code Commission, and we're expecting to get a few wins in the next code cycle. Similarly, but also quite differently, the third thing we're working on is to make current homes, existing homes, more resilient to natural catastrophes. And again, this involves getting homeowners on side, realizing the risks that they face, and guiding them as to the measures they can take to make their homes safer. This is trickier than changing building code. First of all, because retrofitting existing homes can be costly, particularly when you're talking about earthquake and wind, because all the changes you make have to be behind the drywall. These are expensive changes. But if a major renovation is taking place, why not make your home more resilient? It's not as costly as some people think it is. We have a program called Showcase Homes, where once or twice a year, we'll go somewhere in the country, we'll retrofit a home against the hazards common in that area, and then we'll roll out that home to the media and have an event. We've done it in 20 communities so far. And the idea is to say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Homeowner, you can run out to Home Depot, Canadian Tire, get a few things, and make your home more resilient. Bring it down to people so they can understand that this is not necessarily a huge undertaking. Finally, we're looking at expanding the role of insurance in Canada. The Bank of International Settlements did some research and found that where pre-financing is in place and a disaster hits, that community, that country, whatever it happens to be, will rebound faster. Claims money is liquidity. And when we pump money into places like Fort McMurray, that's liquidity that helps that community bounce back again. Some of our other work has found that when there's a natural disaster in Canada, only 40% of it is insured. 60% of it is not insured. We're trying to narrow that gap by helping companies provide new insurance products like overland flood insurance and things of that nature. We work from the premise at ICLR that the impacts of disaster damage to people and property is largely preventable, especially if decision makers apply the risk reduction knowledge and science that we develop and that others develop and get it operationalized and in use. We firmly believe that natural hazards don't have to mean natural catastrophes. Thanks very much.